She was the dream that became real. So rare, so precious. I was afraid to breathe, afraid to break her. But dreams have a way of shattering, don't they? Especially when the ghosts of the past come knocking. I always told myself I'd marry someone untouched by anyone else, someone whose heart and body bore no marks from another's hands. Old-fashioned? Maybe. Obsessive? Call it what you want. But I couldn't stand the thought of sharing her, not with anyone, not even the echoes of her past. Then came Emma, proof that rare, good things still existed. Or so I thought. When I met Emma, I knew she was what I'd been searching for, like a rare gem hidden in the chaos of modern life. She had this air of innocence, a softness that made you feel calm, just being near her. I didn't ask about her past much. I didn't need to. Everything about her screamed new beginnings. She wasn't the kind of woman you doubted. I remember the first time I saw her smile, really smile. We were at some friend's barbecue, and I'd been dragged there last minute. I didn't want to go, but then she walked in, holding a plate of something she'd baked, her hair tucked behind her. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't the type to walk in and command a room with her looks. But when she laughed, everything around her blurred. She wasn't just beautiful. She was warm, the kind of person who made you feel like you'd known her your whole life. And when I finally worked up the courage to ask her out, she said yes without a moment's hesitation. That night, I remember thinking, this is it. She's the one. For a while, life was like a movie montage of every perfect moment you can imagine. Late-night drives, lazy Sundays in bed, quiet moments where we didn't need to speak. She wasn't just my wife, she was my best friend. I'd wake up in the morning, roll over, and see her still asleep, her hair a mess, her breathing soft. And I'd just stare, thinking, how the hell did I get so lucky? I'd built this image of her in my mind, a masterpiece of loyalty and purity. She was untouched by the world, untouched by anyone but me. And maybe that was my first mistake, believing she could be everything I wanted her to be, without ever questioning if she wanted to live up to that impossible image. When I finally proposed, it wasn't some grand spectacle. I didn't need fireworks or a crowd. We were in the kitchen, she was barefoot, wearing one of my oversized t-shirts while making coffee. I slid the ring onto the counter next to her cup and just asked her. Her eyes went wide, and she started, crying before she even said yes. That moment? I've replayed it 1,000 times. The way her hands shook as she put on the ring. The way she hugged me like she'd never let go. It wasn't just love, it was certainty. She wasn't just someone I wanted. She was my future, my everything. But looking back, I realize I wasn't just marrying her. I was marrying the version of her I'd built up in my mind. I was blind to the cracks in the foundation. I wanted her to be mine in every way that mattered. And for a long time, I thought she was. I thought she was exactly who I believed her to be. But life isn't a dream, and no one can live under a spotlight of perfection forever. I just didn't know that yet. If someone had told me back then that I'd one day be sitting at our dining room table, staring at a letter that shattered everything I believed in, I wouldn't have believed them. But that's the thing about illusions. They blind you until the truth burns everything down. And God help me, I never saw the fire coming. Our first year of marriage felt like something out of a storybook. Every morning, I'd wake up to her curled up next to me, her face peaceful, like the world didn't have a single weight on her shoulders. She'd mumble good morning in that sleepy voice of hers, and I'd feel like I'd won some cosmic lottery. We moved into a small house with creaky floors and a garden she insisted on turning into her project. Emma had this way of making everything feel like a home, filling the space with little touches, throw blankets, candles that smelled like fresh bread, and those ridiculous motivational quotes she hung on the walls. You're right where you need to be. Ironically, I believed that. Our routines became sacred. Friday night takeouts with some terrible rom-com she forced me to watch. Saturday mornings spent at the farmer's market, where she'd haggle over flowers and fruit like she was preparing for a banquet. I liked that about her, how she could make the mundane feel important. It was never boring with her, but the thing is, perfection has a way of blinding you. It lulls you into complacency, and I was no exception. It started small, Little things that I brushed off. She'd be distracted at dinner, staring off into space with her fork halfway to her mouth. Or she'd spend longer than usual in the other room, scrolling through her phone with this serious look on her face. I'd joke about her being addicted to social media, and she'd laugh it off, calling me an old man. Then came the nights she didn't want to watch our usual movies. Instead, she'd retreat early to bed, claiming she was exhausted. And maybe she was. But the way she pulled the blankets tight around her felt different. Like she was building a wall between us. I remember one night lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I could hear her breathing beside me, soft and steady, but I felt like she was a million miles away. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone drifts a little sometimes, right? People go through phases, work stress, hormones, whatever excuse made me feel better at the time. And then there was the trip. She told me she was heading out of town for a few days with some friends, a cabin trip. Just a girl's thing, she'd said, brushing it off like it was no big deal. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd never given me a reason not to trust her. But when she left, the house felt wrong, empty. I convinced myself I was just being dramatic. She was allowed to have her own life outside of me. That's healthy, right? But something gnawed at me. The way she hesitated when I asked for details. The way she dodged my offer to drop her off at the airport, insisting one of her friends would handle it. A part of me wanted to ask more questions, but I held back. I didn't want to be the controlling husband, the kind of guy who doesn't trust his wife. When she came back 3 days later, she smelled different. Not bad, just different, like a new perfume. I joked about it, and she laughed, saying it was probably from one of her friends borrowing her jacket. I laughed too. I pretended it was nothing. But the feeling stayed, sitting heavy in my chest. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was sitting at the dining room table, sorting through a pile of papers for a tax receipt I needed. Emma was still asleep upstairs. I sifted through bill after bill, boring adult stuff, until my hand brushed against something that didn't belong. An envelope. It was tucked between some junk mail, half hidden. At first, I thought it was just one of those pre-approved credit offers or some ad, but then I saw her name. Not our name, just hers. Written in this looping, messy handwriting I didn't recognize. Curiosity prickled at the back of my neck. I don't know what made me open it. Maybe I already knew something wasn't right. The letter inside was short, but hit me like a fist to the gut. Emma, I've been losing sleep thinking about you. I can still feel you. The way you looked that night, the way you smiled before. You kissed me. I thought I could handle this, but I can't. I need you. Please tell me you feel the same way. I'm going crazy here. M. My heart stopped. Literally, for a second, I forgot how to breathe. I read it again, and again, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something harmless, something that didn't make my world tilt sideways. But they didn't. The message was clear. Someone out there was in love with my wife, someone who wasn't me. I sat there, gripping that letter so tight, my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing. A million questions crashed through my head, but one screamed louder than the rest. Who the hell is M? I was shaking, trying to hold it together, but the room felt like it was closing in on me. My throat was dry, my chest tight, and upstairs, Emma was still asleep, completely unaware that the world she'd built with me was seconds away from burning. Down. I should have waited, should have thought it through, but I couldn't. I stood up, that letter burning in my hand, and started up the stairs. This wasn't going to be another morning. This was the end of the dream. When I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped, just for a second. My hand hovered over the bedroom door handle, and I could feel my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I wanted to believe there was some reasonable explanation, something stupid, something innocent. But the words from the letter kept hammering in my head. I can still feel you. Please tell me you feel the same. I pushed the door open. Emma was still in bed, her hair messy, the covers pulled up to her shoulders. She looked peaceful. For a brief, fleeting second, I hesitated. She looked so perfect, so much like the woman I had built my life around. Maybe if I closed the door and walked away, I could pretend I hadn't seen anything. Maybe life could stay the same, but I couldn't unsee it. The letter was still crumpled in my fist. I stepped closer, my shadow falling across her face. She stirred a little, opened her eyes, blinking up at me with that sleepy confusion she always had in the morning. "Hey," she murmured, her voice soft. "What's wrong?" I held up the letter, my hand trembling. "This," I said, barely recognizing my own voice. "What the hell is this, Emma?" Her smile vanished. She sat up, rubbing her eyes as though she hadn't seen it clearly the first time. When she realized what I was holding, the blood drained from her face. She looked like I'd caught her standing in front of an open vault with a bag of cash. "Where did you find that?" she asked quietly, her voice small. "That's what you're asking me?" I snapped, my voice breaking. "Not what it's about, not who the hell this guy is, just where I found it?" She swallowed hard and swung her legs off the bed, planting her feet on the floor. She wasn't crying, wasn't panicking. She just sat there, staring at the letter in my hand like it was a ticking bomb. I took a step closer. "Who's M?" I demanded. She didn't answer. "Emma." I was losing control now, my voice shaking. "Who is M?" She closed her eyes like she was trying to block me out. When she opened them again, they were glassy, full of guilt. "He's someone I used to know." Her words were so quiet I almost didn't hear them. "Used to?" I laughed bitterly, holding up the letter. "He's talking about now, Emma. About some night you two spent together. So don't stand there and tell me this is in the past." She finally stood up, barefoot and small, in front of me, her hands trembling as she reached out like she was going to touch my arm, but stopped herself. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she whispered. "Didn't mean for me." "To find out?" I spat. "You mean you didn't want me to know at all?" Silence. Her eyes fell to the floor, and that was my answer, my vision blurred with rage. I had to take a step back just to stop myself from losing it completely. "How long?" I asked. She didn't respond. I grabbed the nearest thing, one of the stupid decorative vases she loved, and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, and Emma flinched but didn't move. "How long?" I screamed. Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hands, like she was trying to hold the words in. "A few months," she finally whispered. "It's been a few months." The room spun. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. Months. I stumbled back until I hit the wall and sank to the floor, staring at her in disbelief. "Why?" I whispered. Tears streamed down her face now, but I didn't care. She looked like the victim, and that only made me angrier. "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I was lonely and things got complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, disgusted. "We're married, Emma. Married. Do you have any idea what you've done?" She wiped at her face, shaking her head. "You were gone so much," she whispered. "You were always working, always distracted. I tried to tell you how I was feeling, but you didn't hear me. You think this is my fault?" I shot to my feet, rage burning through my veins. "You think me working to give us a good life somehow excuses you screwing some other guy?" "No," she said quickly. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" I was right in front of her now, our faces inches apart. "Because right now, all I'm hearing is you making excuses. I made a mistake." She choked on the words. "I wasn't trying to hurt you." I laughed again, a bitter, hollow sound. "Not trying to hurt me? You think that makes it better? You let me believe we were happy, Emma. You let me build my whole life around you, around this, and it was all a lie." She reached for me again, and I stepped back, out of reach. Her touch felt toxic now. "Is it still going on?" I asked, my voice low and cold. She hesitated, and my heart broke all over again. "No," she finally said. "It ended." "When?" "A few weeks ago." I shook my head, laughing bitterly. "Right. So you just decided one day to stop? And what? You thought we'd just go on like nothing happened?" She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't want to hear it. I couldn't. "You don't get to fix this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get to say you're sorry and act like that changes anything." I turned and started toward the door, feeling like if I stayed another second, I'd suffocate. "Please don't go," she said behind me, her voice breaking. I stopped but didn't turn around. "You've already left," I said quietly. "You left the moment you let him touch you." The silence behind me felt like a final nail in the coffin. I walked out the door, out of the house, and into a world that suddenly felt foreign. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I don't remember much about the drive. I wasn't even sure where I was headed. I just drove, past neighborhoods I recognized, past places Emma and I used to go together. The world outside blurred into meaningless shapes and colors, like I was underwater. My hands were clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that they ached, but I couldn't let go. I ended up at a gas station off the highway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I sat there in the parking lot, staring out at nothing. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, lighting up with Emma's name. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again and again. Finally, I grabbed it and hurled it into the passenger seat, where it thudded against the dashboard and went dark. I couldn't listen to her voice, couldn't read her apologies or whatever excuse she was trying to send me. I stepped out of the car and into the cool night air, trying to steady my breathing. The gas station was nearly empty, just a bored attendant behind the glass playing on his phone. I stood there, hands in my pockets, staring at my reflection. In the window, I looked wrecked. My hair was a mess, my eyes bloodshot, my face pale. I hardly recognized myself. I'd always prided myself on being calm, composed. I was the guy people came to when they needed someone stable. But now, I felt like I was crumbling from the inside out. The door chimed as I walked inside. The bright lights stung my eyes. I grabbed a bottle of water, paid without saying a word, and stepped back out into the night. I sat on the curb, unscrewed the cap, and took a long drink, hoping it would wash away the sick feeling in my stomach, but it didn't. Nothing could. My mind kept replaying the same scenes over and over. The letter. The way Emma looked at me when I confronted her, like a child caught stealing. Her excuses, her tears. I'd given her everything. I'd built my life around her, and she'd found comfort in the arms of someone else. Some guy named M, someone who knew her in ways I thought were mine alone. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that I didn't even know who she was anymore. I thought I'd married someone pure, someone who shared my values, who wanted what I wanted. But maybe I never really knew her at all. Maybe I'd just fallen in love with an idea, a version of her that never actually existed. A car pulled into the station, its headlights flashing over me. I squinted, half expecting it to be Emma. I wouldn't have been surprised if she'd driven out here, desperate to find me, to beg me to come back. But it wasn't her. Just some stranger filling up their tank. I stood up, dusted off my jeans, and walked back to my car. I didn't know what I was doing or where I was going, but I couldn't stay here. As soon as I got behind the wheel, my phone lit up again. Another text from her. Against my better judgment, I picked it up and read it. "Please come home. We need to talk." Talk. The nerve of her. She'd had months to talk to me, to tell me how she was feeling. Instead, she'd chosen lies and silence. What the hell was left to say? I threw the phone down again and started the car, driving back toward town. I wasn't going home, not yet, but I needed answers. I couldn't sit in that fog of uncertainty. There was only one place I could think to go. 20 minutes later, I was standing outside a small brick apartment complex on the edge of the city. I'd tracked down M, the only way I knew how, by remembering the address scrawled at the bottom of the letter, apartment 3B. My fists were clenched as I climbed the narrow staircase, the sound of my footsteps bouncing off the walls. I had no idea what I was going to do when I saw him. Part of me wanted to drag him outside and beat him into the pavement. The other part of me wanted to demand answers, to see for myself the man my wife had chosen over me. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I knocked. Seconds passed. I heard movement inside, footsteps approaching. The door opened, and I came face to face with him. He wasn't what I expected. I'd pictured someone tall, suave, maybe older. But M was ordinary. He had shaggy brown hair, a scruffy beard, and wore a wrinkled t-shirt with some band logo on it. He wasn't intimidating. He didn't look like the kind of guy who could ruin a marriage. His eyes widened when he saw me. He knew exactly who I was. "You're him," I said, my voice low, barely controlled. He swallowed hard. Look, man. Before he could finish, I shoved him back into the apartment and slammed the door behind me. He stumbled, but didn't fight back. I don't want your excuses, I growled. I want the truth, all of it. He held up his hands, shaking his head. I didn't know she was married. Not at first. Bullshit. I took a step closer and he backed up against the wall. You knew. Don't lie to me. He stared at the floor, ashamed. Yeah, he muttered. I knew, eventually. The words hit like a punch to the gut. How long? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just ran a hand through his hair, sighing. Almost 4 months. My vision blurred with rage again. 4 months. 4 months of my wife sneaking around, lying to my face, living a double life. Why? I asked, feeling pathetic for even needing to know. What was it about you? He shook his head. It wasn't like that. She wasn't trying to replace you, man. She felt lost. She told me you didn't listen to her anymore, that you were always busy, always distant. Don't. I pointed a finger at him, warning him not to make this about me. But deep down, those words burrowed in. The doubts I'd tried to push down since the day I found the letter started rising to the surface. I'm not saying it was right, he said quickly. It wasn't. I ended it. I couldn't keep doing it, knowing she was lying to you. I stared at him, trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth. I hated him, but part of me believed him, and that made it worse. I took a step back, suddenly exhausted. My anger was fading, replaced by something colder, an emptiness that felt endless. Don't ever contact her again, I said, my voice hollow. He nodded quickly. I turned and walked out without another word. When I got back in my car, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. The reality of it all hit me like a wave. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd chosen someone ordinary, someone boring and flawed. And that's when I realized something that broke me all over again. She hadn't cheated because he was better. She'd cheated because she thought I wasn't enough. I don't remember how long I sat in the car after leaving his apartment. Time felt warped. Minutes stretched into hours, or maybe the other way around. The world outside felt distant, muted. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't anything. I drove home because I didn't know where else to go. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. Her car was there, but no lights were on. I killed the engine and just sat there for a while, staring at the front door. My hands rested on my lap, still trembling, but my mind was eerily calm, almost numb. Eventually, I got out and walked to the door. When I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards felt foreign, like it wasn't even my home anymore. The place felt hollow, as if all the warmth had drained out of it. Emma was sitting on the couch, knees pulled up to her chest, eyes red from crying. She didn't say anything as I walked in. She just watched me, her face etched with fear and regret. I shut the door behind me and stood there staring at her. "Did you find him?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I nodded. Her shoulders sagged. What did he say?" "He told me the truth," I said flatly. She flinched, as though the word truth had cut through her. I walked past her into the kitchen, grabbed a glass, and filled it with water. She stayed on the couch, silent, like she didn't know how to approach me. When I finally came back into the living room, I stood a few feet away from her, staring at the woman I thought I knew. The same woman I once swore I'd spend my life with. She looked so small now, so broken, but all I could feel when I looked at her was loss. "Why?" I asked again, though I wasn't sure I even wanted the answer anymore. I already knew the facts. What I didn't understand was why. Her hands twisted together in her lap, nervous. She opened her mouth but hesitated like she didn't know where to start. I was lonely," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I know that sounds stupid, but it's true." "Lonely," I repeated, tasting the word, feeling the bitterness of it. "You were lonely." She nodded, wiping at her cheeks. You were always gone. You'd come home late, exhausted. I'd wait for you to ask me how my day was, but you didn't. And after a while, I just felt invisible. Invisible, I muttered, shaking my head. Emma, we're all lonely sometimes. That's marriage. It's not perfect every second, of every day. But you don't solve it by crawling into someone else's bed. Her face crumpled. I didn't mean for it to happen. But it did. My voice was sharp now, harsher than I meant it to be. You made a choice, Emma. Don't sit there and tell me you just slipped. She sobbed, pressing her hands to her face. And for a second, I felt the old part of me stir, the part that wanted to comfort her, to wrap my arms around her and tell her everything would be okay. But that part of me was dying, suffocating under the weight of her betrayal. I didn't love him, she said through her tears. Don't. I held up a hand. I don't want to hear that. Do you know how insane that sounds? You didn't love him, but you were willing to throw away everything for him. For what? A few nights? A few goddamn texts? She couldn't even look at me. My chest was heaving now, the numbness cracking open, giving way to something raw and ugly. You were my everything, Emma, I said, my voice breaking. I gave you everything I had. I built my life around you. I trusted you. I know, she whispered. I know. And I'm so sorry. I wish I could undo it. Her words fell like ashes. I stared at her for a long time. The silence between us was deafening. The clock on the wall ticked, counting out the seconds of our ruined life. Finally, I sank into the chair across from her, exhausted. Is this who you really are? I asked quietly. The person you've been pretending to be? Was that ever real? Her head snapped up. Of course it was, she cried. I loved you. I love you. What we had was real. I shook my head, bitterness rising in my throat. You don't get to say that. You don't get to tell me you loved me while you were sneaking around behind my back. She reached out like she was about to touch me, but I leaned away. Her hand fell limply to her side. I don't even know you anymore, I said, my voice hollow. She broke down, burying her face in her hands. But I couldn't cry. I was too far gone for tears. I felt drained, like there was nothing left of me but a shell. What do you want me to do? She whispered through her sobs. Tell me what? To fix this. I'll do anything. I looked at her, and for the first time since finding that letter, I felt the weight of the truth settle over me. You can't fix this, I said quietly. There's no going back. Her eyes filled with panic. No, please, don't say that. I stood up, running a hand through my hair. You destroyed something, Emma, and some things. They can't be put back together. She stood up too, desperate now. We can try. We can go to counseling. We can... Stop. My voice was firm. Just stop. The room felt suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my keys off the counter, and her face crumbled when she realized what I was doing. Please, she whispered. I paused at the door, looking back at her one last time. I felt the weight of every memory, the laughter, the quiet mornings, the dreams we'd built together, and all of it was stained now, ruined. I don't hate you, I said, surprising myself, but I can't forgive you. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, sobbing. I turned away, opened the door, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, biting against my skin. But it felt like freedom. I didn't know where I was going, only that I was done. Done with the lies. Done pretending. Done trying to piece together something that was already broken beyond repair. Behind me, the door clicked shut. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The sky was still dark when I drove away from the house, but there was the faintest hint of dawn creeping over the horizon. It wasn't some poetic moment of rebirth. It wasn't that clean. Nothing about this felt like a fresh start. It felt like ashes, like I was standing in the ruins of the life I'd spent years building. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was headed. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by memories that had turned toxic overnight. I drove aimlessly until I saw a 24-hour diner glowing like a lonely beacon in the distance. The parking lot was almost empty, and the place looked as run down as I felt. I pulled in and parked, killing the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. Inside, the place smelled like coffee and burnt toast. An old man sat in the corner booth nursing a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the TV mounted on the wall. The waitress behind the counter gave me a polite, tired smile as I slid into a booth by the window. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, notepad in hand. "Coffee," I said, my voice rough. "Black." She nodded and shuffled away. I sat there staring out the window at the empty street, my reflection barely visible in the glass. I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. He looked hollow, eyes sunken, and lifeless. The waitress set a mug down in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. I took a sip, barely tasting it. As I sat there, alone in that booth, the full weight of everything hit me. I'd really walked out. I'd left the woman I thought I'd spend my life with. I'd left the house we'd made a home. The reality of it settled deep into my bones. My marriage was over. I thought about the way Emma had looked at me, desperate, shattered, but I couldn't find sympathy for her, not after what she'd done. She'd taken everything I believed in, everything I trusted, and shattered it like glass. And for what? A few moments of escape? The truth was, she'd killed the version of me that believed in forever. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, vibrating against the vinyl seat. I didn't need to look at it to know it was her. I didn't want to read her texts or hear her voice. Not now. Maybe not ever. I stared at the phone for a long time before finally reaching for it. I opened it to see her message, a single, desperate line. "Please come back. I love you." Love. I almost laughed at the word. Whatever she thought love was, it wasn't the same thing I'd built my life around. Love wasn't supposed to be selfish. Love wasn't supposed to leave scars like this. I locked the phone and set it face down on the table. My hands were still, shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from the rage or the grief. Maybe both. The old man in the corner booth looked over at me, his expression unreadable. He raised his mug in a silent toast, and for some reason I nodded back. Maybe he saw something in me that he recognized. Pain, regret, loss. I wondered how many people had sat in this same booth at 4 a.m., trying to make sense of the wreckage of their lives. The waitress came back, refilling my coffee. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone gentle. "Something like that," I muttered. She nodded like she understood, like she'd seen this story play out before. Maybe she had. I sat there for what felt like hours, the sky outside slowly lightening, as dawn crept in. I thought about everything: Emma, the letter, the guy in that shitty apartment. I thought about the promises we'd made to each other, the life we'd built, the future that had been ripped away. But most of all, I thought about who I was before all of this. I'd been so sure of myself, so sure of her. I'd believed in the fairy tale, that if you loved someone enough, you could build something unbreakable. But love, real love, isn't about the absence of temptation or mistakes. It's about trust. And once that trust is gone, no amount of love can put it back together. The sun was fully up by the time I paid the check and left the diner. The air was crisp, the world quiet. I stood by my car, breathing in the cold morning air, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Not peace, not forgiveness, but clarity. I couldn't go back. Not to her, not to that life. I wasn't the same person who walked into that house yesterday. That person was dead. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for me to figure out who I was now, without her. I got in the car and drove away. The road stretched out in front of me, endless and empty. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't looking back. The life I'd known was over, but I was still here. And maybe somehow that was enough.